Welcome to Lecture 2 of Art Appreciation. This will conclude the content that will be on test number 1. And as we go through this PowerPoint, I'll point out what you need to know for the test and also some of the extra little things about some of the artwork that you may not get from just looking at it. So as we talk about how we look and see and become aware of things around us, there's some simple concepts that we need to understand a little bit better. First of all, when we think about how we visualize something, that means to have that image kind of reoccur in our imagination and um, in our memory. And whenever we look at something and we think about it, there's a lot of things that come into play. Um, our, our intellect or our education, our emotions or how we're feeling, and what we like and don't like, and our values and ethics, and even what we're interested in. And so the reason I'm pointing this out first is that a lot of times I think we expect too much of art whenever we go to a museum or a gallery, or we flip through maybe your textbook for the class. A lot of people are like, it's not doing anything for me, and they don't look any further. But we have to realize that everything that we come to, there's other stuff affecting it, from what's going on in our life at that moment to how we're feeling. And so I think sometimes we have to kind of set that aside if we really want to appreciate a work of art, is to realize, be conscious of those different things that possibly could get in the way, and then to allow ourselves to be more curious and investigate a little bit more, not expecting the art to do the work, but to make our own minds and interests do the work. Now, whenever we are interacting with our surroundings, we're basically doing two things: perceiving and being aware. Perceiving means to just use our senses, our physical senses, and to get around in this world. And being aware means that you become conscious, you think about it. There's something that you process and understand or feel from that awareness. And so think about things that you do on a day-to-day basis where maybe you're perceiving, but you're not really being aware. A lot of times, if you drive or take public transportation to school, do you think about how many times you stop at red lights or at different stations? Do you think about how many people are on the trains with you, or how many people you're passing on the road? When you're getting ready in the morning, do you consciously think about what you're wearing to class or getting ready? There's a lot of things that I don't think, process, that we just kind of get our ways. When you're walking down the hall at school, do you count how many people you see? Do you know how many, um, could you give descriptions of them? A lot of times we don't, because we're just trying to survive and get by. We're just perceiving. But whenever we're aware, if you think to like big moments in your lives, you probably remember a lot of details, and that's because you were feeling so much, you really took in all that information. And so whenever we're looking at art, we want to try to be a little bit more aware and conscious and try to understand things rather than just glancing over it really quickly. Okay? And there's a quote here that I really like. It says, "The eyes are blind to what the mind cannot see." And that's really true. You have to really be conscious and fully awake to become aware and to see what's around you. This is one of my favorite quotes. It says, "Seeing is forgetting the name of the thing one sees." When I teach drawing, this is the thing I teach my students at the very beginning. Is a lot of times they come to me with excuses like, I can't draw faces, or I can't draw hands, or I can't draw glass, and I'm like, why? You should be able to see it. And but the problem is that because we give things names, we say, well, this thing is more complicated, but it's really not. If we can see it, it's made up of light and value and lines and shapes, and just like anything else. And so I think if you really want to become aware of something, you have to totally forget the name of it and see it with new eyes, to discover it, to be curious, all of those things. And when we do that, ordinary things can really become extraordinary and can be very inspirational. And we'll look at some examples of that in the next several slides. Now, not all artists think or see the same way, but I think that a lot of artists do, they're more conscious, I think, of their surroundings and they can find inspiration in the smallest of things. And I know this because most of my friends aren't artists. And so sometimes they get annoyed by me wanting to take pictures of everything or question every little thing that I see. And but then every now and then I'll kind of rub off on them and I'll see them doing, similar things. So let's say you're driving home from school one day and it's the fall and you didn't even really notice it, but all of a sudden all the trees are different colors. Maybe that sparks your interest and you're like, whoa, how did I not even notice that this happened? Then maybe one tree stands out to you because the colors are just much more rich or vivid, or maybe almost seem unnatural. And so you look at that tree closer. And then maybe just looking at one leaf that's fallen from that tree, you're inspired. Like, whoa, the whole variety of color and texture and all that I saw in that whole landscape, I can see in this one tiny leaf, something that if I wasn't paying attention, I might have just stepped on and been worrying about, something else that maybe is not really that significant. And then maybe because you find such beauty in that one thing, you look even closer and you see it at like a cellular level. Maybe this inspires you to want to know what's happening with photosynthesis if you're a scientist, or maybe as an artist, this inspires you to do a whole series of paintings or drawings based upon these sort of patterns and colors and designs that you see. So, again, not all artists are that way, but it just goes to show you that anything you look at closer, you're going to find more um, rewarding experience there if you just keep looking closer and closer. Now, when I first advanced this slide, and before you had a chance to read this, your imagination probably told you that this image that you're looking at is a bunch of different things. I've heard people say a tongue, a fist, someone's back, a lot of different things, but this is just a photo of a bell pepper. But Edward Weston, he was a photographer in the early 1900s that he liked to shoot black and white photographs of objects from the side that we didn't recognize them, that we associated them with a name. And so normally when we see a bell pepper, we see it from the top, and that's how we recognize it. But by seeing this one in black and white and from the bottom view, you almost don't recognize it. It almost looks like something human. And so most of his photography, it sort of tricked your eye. You didn't know what it was at first. You had to look closer and you had to usually your imagination. Kind of like when you look at the clouds when maybe you were a kid and you would see objects, or maybe if you've like me, I like to look at marble tiles and see all kinds of different shapes and faces and stuff in them. So it just is using your imagination. This is another photo that he did of a shell. But when you first look at it, you can see maybe it kind of looks like a light bulb or something alien, maybe, or a shovel of some kind. But normally, when we see a snail shell, we see it from the side and we see that spiral design that tells us what it is. But this is looking inside of it. And so, just by changing the view that we normally associate this object with a name, it makes us see something else and it makes us use our imagination and it makes us curious. This When I first saw this piece, I thought, "Holy cow, Batman! You just jumped off a building and landed on your feet," because it looks like there's a person under this flowing cape. It's very dramatic, but this is just a piece of cabbage that he photographed, and it looks like it's something, some type of fabric or some type of a costume of some kind. And I'm not expecting after this lecture that you go to Kroger or Tom Thumb and you walk around the produce section staring at all the fruits and vegetables with awe. That might get you in trouble there. I don't know. But I do want you to hopefully start to look at things closer and start to see what else that you can see, to see if there's inspiration there, to see if there's imagination there. Because a lot of times it's not, it doesn't have to be something complex. It can be the most simple of experiences that can really give us extraordinary ideas and um, fulfillment. So, to make all this a little bit more simple, is what's the difference between looking and seeing? Basically, those words are like perceiving and being aware. looking is like perceiving, where seeing is like being aware. So looking is just using our mechanical senses like perceiving, but seeing is a more active extension of looking. Okay, so you can look around a whole gallery, but when you see something, that means that maybe you notice a piece of art that stands out because of the color that's used or how it makes you feel, etc. Now, being an art person since college, I used to hear the word aesthetics a lot, and it always seemed like a very high class word. And it was one of those words that I would hear and want to roll my eyes because it seemed like something that pretentious people would say. And then when I learned the true meaning of it, I was kind of upset. I was like, why do people ruin this word? Because it's really such a wonderful word and it's such a wonderful experience. And that's exactly what it means is it's an experience that a viewer has with something. Okay. And what it does is an aesthetic experience is where you are moved in some way emotionally, physically, um, intellectually, but whatever that is that your experience is, it changes you in that moment. So think of you've probably had this happen before with movies. You've probably all sat in a theater before where you jumped back in your seat because you were scared, or you started crying because it was so emotional, or you laughed out loud because it was so funny. Even though you're around a bunch of strangers, you couldn't help but laugh out loud. So those are all aesthetic experiences, and art can do the same thing. Now, the problem is a lot of times people will use this word to describe things as like everybody should like this, but really, aesthetic is an individual experience. You could have an aesthetic experience watching a thunderstorm or watching a baby being born or whatever. It varies from person to person. So aesthetic means it's just something is evoked inside of you. I'm a twin, and my twin brother and we're very different. And I like to think I have a lot of aesthetic experiences because I'm sensitive and I really like nature and all these things. So I'm easily awed and impressed by things. But my twin brother, he's not. He played sports all through school. He likes to hunt and do all these things that I don't necessarily do. I've never really seen him have an experience like this. He's very macho. He often punches me in the stomach still today to knock my breath out because he thinks it's funny. And but I've never seen him have like an emotional reaction to anything. However, when he had his first child, I was in class and I got a text saying, "Hey, my wife's in labor. If you want to come meet your, niece or nephew, come soon." And I thought, "Oh, wow, he's so excited." But then when I got to the hospital, my sister-in-law had already had her baby. And I got to the hospital and I was walking down the hall, and all of a sudden I see my twin brother, and he's like running towards me, and felt like I should take like a football stance or something to prepare for his attack. But when he got closer to me, I noticed he was crying, and he just hugged me and embraced me and was like, "Oh, you have to come see her. She's beautiful." And he grabbed my hand and was like holding my hand, and he kept hugging me, telling me he loved me, and he gave me my niece and was like, "Here, hold her. You're going to be the best uncle, and you're going to teach her how to make art and all this stuff." And inside, I was like, this is that moment that twins have. And he had to have a child to feel, the meaning of life and all this stuff. And it really touched me. And I went home and got a bunch of baby gifts and came back the next day, and totally he was back to normal. And so I think that was one of the first aesthetic experiences he had. It took the birth of one of his children to have that experience. But that's a dramatic example. But I think that art can make people have very similar things, and sometimes it can catch you off guard. And but anyway, so that's what aesthetic means: is it's a personal experience where we're moved in some way intellectually, emotionally, or even physically. Now that brings up, well, what does beautiful mean? And please do not ever write "beauty's in the eye of the beholder." Like I've heard that and seen that on multiple essays before. So that's not original. And although it may be true, I want you to come up with your own way to say things. So if you see this on a test, be a little bit more original than that. But whenever we call something pretty or attractive, that means that it's pleasant to look at. And like the last lecture, this would fall under things that fall into that visual delight category. Where beautiful, that would be things that are like an aesthetic experience. It's something that moves us in some way. And so beauty and aesthetics are kind of mean the same thing. So something could be very attractive and be beautiful, or it doesn't even have to be attractive. Sometimes things that are ugly or unattractive can even be beautiful if you think about it. I know when I was a kid, I used to love to stare at my grandmother's hands when she was alive because she had lived through the Great Depression. I think she had almost 20 brothers and sisters growing up, and she had just had a really hard life and only went to school through second grade, never had a driver's license, but she could do anything just because she learned. And her hands were all scarred and wrinkled, and she would get insecure when I would stare at them. But to me, I stared at them because I thought they were magic. And she could do things like take my little crayons that were too little to color with anymore, and she would melt them and swirl them together and put them in like an old lipstick container that she had and make me crayons with multiple colors. And to me, her hands were magic. And but although most people, I guess, would consider them to be scarred and ugly. But, like I said before, things like thunderstorms, even, horrible, dangerous things, some people find beauty and excitement in those things. Even children, as I mentioned before, childbirth is not really pretty, but people, find it beautiful because it moves them emotionally, bringing life into this world. I've never heard anybody say, oh, my grandmother's hot. No offense to grandmothers, but we often call them beautiful, right? Because we love them and care for them and all the stuff that they've taught us and that they've lived through. Even people's pets, sometimes they will have very ugly pets, but they love them and they find beauty in them because of their personalities and everything like that. So just like that, compared to life, we can have the same outlook for art as well. And Van Gogh, he painted all sorts of different things, but one thing he painted was this skeleton smoking. And although we've seen skeletons before, but seeing one with a cigarette in its mouth, especially today, we can't help but think about the dangers of smoking and all of that. So it probably makes you feel something emotionally and maybe moves you. And he was one that definitely captured a bunch of different things that maybe weren't considered to be pretty, but he captured them in their true essence. Leonardo da Vinci, we'll talk about more in this class later. However, one of the things, even though he's known for painting the Mona Lisa, one of the most beautiful, painted portraits that a lot of people consider to be the most beautiful portraits in the world, he actually was obsessed with people that looked different. And in his sketchbooks, there's a lot of drawings of people that just looked really, really different or strange, even. And supposedly, if he saw someone that was disfigured in some way, he would follow them around, sketching them until he could do it from memory. Because to him, those people were more beautiful than people that look like everybody else. I kind of went over this already, but we're all artists when we're kids, and we all want to draw, and we're actually learning to see a lot of times when we're kids, and that's why we start out drawing like this, and then we develop and get better as we get older. But when we stop, some of us kind of stop there. But if you want to get better, take my drawing class. But art can do a lot of things. It can capture moments in time, recreate experiences, and connect lives. And this painting from the early Renaissance, this is before Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael and all those other artists that you probably heard of before from the High Renaissance. This was from the early Renaissance by an artist named Robert Campin. And when we look at this, how does it capture moments in time? Well, it's capturing a moment from a biblical story of the Virgin Mary. But also, if you look at it, it doesn't really look like biblical times. And that's because Robert Campin painted this to make it look like people from the Renaissance. And you may wonder, well, why would he do that? Well, just like people, for the same reason people remake movies and music today, is so it's more relatable to the people today than it was back then. And so here he made this little triptych, which means that it's three panels that go together as one piece that can be open and closed. This would probably have been put on an altar or in someone's home for private devotion, but most likely probably in a church where people would see it at different times of the year. And looking at this, we can see that there's the Virgin Mary in the center with the Archangel Gabriel. And this is supposed to be the moment, according to the Christian faith, where the angel visited Mary, telling her that she was selected by God to have his child. And we can see her so devout in her um, reading that she didn't even notice this angel coming into the room. Now, who are the other people? Well, this is supposed to be Joseph, who was not the father of Jesus, but he raised Jesus as his own. And people of that time would have known that this was Joseph because in the Bible he's mentioned as being a carpenter, and we can see him in a carpentry studio working on a variety of different things. And if you look out that window, you can see this early Renaissance town, which is really cool that it's so contemporary, yet it's telling a biblical story. So hopefully the people in the Renaissance that would have been going to church or whatever, that they would have seen these people and what looked like their homes, and they would have thought, well, maybe if I'm really, strong in my faith, maybe I'll be selected for something amazing. And so that maybe makes you wonder, well, who are these people over here on their knees looking into the door at the angel and Mary? Well, those are supposed to be the patrons. And the patrons are people that purchase artwork. And so these are the people that would have commissioned the painting. And so the artist put them in it. So it's like they're witnessing this event that's happening, even though it happened way before their lives. So we're connected to it in our time period, to the Renaissance, to the biblical times, and they're being connected to it as well. And so, just like today, when people donate money to a school, maybe their names will be put in a book in the library, like this was donated by so and so, or maybe it will be a bench that's put around the school that has the person's name on it. So back then, they would put people in the painting as like a tribute to them for donating the money. Now, if you look behind the two people kneeling, you'll see a man in the background standing by a gate. That supposedly is a self portrait of the artist, like he threw a little selfie in there to be included. Now, so this has captured two moments in time, the Renaissance and biblical times. And then it's also recreated experiences from Renaissance and these other times. And it's connecting lives of people that us to them that would have never happened before. So art can really break a lot of boundaries and connect us in a lot of different ways. And we'll talk about perspective later in this semester. And so I want you to remember, look at the table in the center, how it looks like a slide and everything's falling. They hadn't quite perfected perspective or the sense of depth in artwork yet. But I want you to remember this painting looks really great, but they hadn't perfected that yet. So remember that when we get to that later this semester. So we talked a little bit about creativity and why people need to be creative. If all we did was just keep replicating what people have done in the past in every career, we would not have any evolution at all. So creativity is important not just for art, but also for science. Like we have to constantly evolve and get better, and we can't just repeat what we've done before. How do you define creativity? Really, it's the source of everything, the source of all art, science, technology, even civilization. And creativity is something you can't really teach people. Maybe you can have them do exercises that inspire creativity, but it's really up to the individual to kind of unlock that part of their mind. Einstein even recognized that imagination was more important than knowledge. A lot of facts, especially with the aid of technology today, can all be looked up. However, you can't make someone be creative. I also put here that creativity is as functional to experiencing and appreciating a work of art as it is to making one. I think as a viewer, you have to use a lot more creativity than the artist. because when an artist wants to make a piece of art, they're inspired and they make it. They don't have to consult anyone beforehand. However, when you go to look at a piece of art to understand it or appreciate it, you have to think, first of all, what's going on in your daily life and what are you dealing with? Then, how did someone make this? Why did they make this? What does it mean? What does it mean to me? And there's all these things you have to think about and go through to try to understand it. So appreciating a work of art, it uses a lot of creativity. And if you think about it, if you've never been to a museum or gallery before, you will be going for this class. But also, when you go, I want you to realize like you'll probably be really tired later in the day because it uses a lot of energy to think about all those things that you see that are made by other people. So it's very creative to contemplate and think about art as well. Now, there's several types of artists out there, and I don't believe I put this on the test, but I know the book mentions it. But there's untrained or naive or outsider artists. Those are people that have had no artistic training at all. It's this number I imagine has gotten very small compared to previous time periods or eras. But in today's world, most people are connected, and we've thought about what is art, or we see pictures of it on Instagram or in our classes. So we've been exposed to art of some kind. But these untrained or outsider artists, they would have never talked about what is art. They would just be making stuff and not really know why. So they would feel very original with everything that they did. Trained artists, that would be people like you or me. Maybe I've been trained more than you because, I was an art major, but you're in an art class right now, and you've probably taken art at some point in your school as well. Folk artists, those are people that are carrying on a tradition where maybe it's more of a job than maybe a passion. And so maybe this is people. These are people making production pottery, where they just make like bowls all day. It's by hand. It's technically art, but it's not necessarily um, something that's self-expressive or anything like that. It's more utilitarian kind of things like quilts or things like that. And so there could be artists that fall that do kind of folk art things, but it still could be self-expressive. But usually folk artists are people that's like kind of their family uh, job that they keep continuing with, if that makes sense. So one of the pros and cons to being trained, obviously you would know where you could get supplies and how to do them. You would know where to find more information. But one of the cons of being a trained artist is that maybe it would be hard to feel original because you've seen so many things before that have been called art. Now, with visual communication, it's really hard to talk about art because it's visual, and not all of us have the same vocabulary, nor do we have the same imagination. So it's really hard to describe to someone what you're seeing if they haven't seen it themselves. So that's why it's important to get some of this vocabulary down so that you can be very clear with what you're trying to say so that people understand you better. And I had a professor once say, just pretend that you're on the phone with them. How would you describe it? And I think that's a really helpful um, activity for students. So imagine this image here. You maybe you've never seen it before. Now in this section, we're going to learn about different categories of art. And when I say categories, I mean visual categories. And this will be on the test. You will be shown works of art, and you'll have to choose whether it's representational, abstract, or non-representational. And these are easy words to understand because all you have to do is compare the art to the real world and see how it compares, and that will help you understand which category that it goes into. And I'm not going to try to trick you or anything like that because there are kind of blurred lines between each of these, and so I wouldn't try to throw an example like that into the mix. But the reason we have these three visual categories is because there's a lot of movements in art history. You've probably heard of things like I mentioned previously, surrealism and cubism and all these realism, all these different isms that are different movements throughout art history. But those usually have to deal with the ideas or images that are being used, whereas these are visual characteristics that can be used to describe artwork throughout all different time periods. So the first one is representational. And so basically that means that it looks real. All right. So that compared to that art object compared to the real world looks super realistic. The reason I don't like to use the word realism instead of representational is because realism is actually a movement from the 1800s where artists depicted the hardships of the working class. And so using that word can be confusing. So representational basically means that it looks like it represents the real world. Okay. And that means by all the elements. So color, line, texture, everything looks real. Okay. Abstract, the word means skewed or altered from reality. And so if it's abstracted, something has been changed. So the elements, the visual elements, line, shape, color, texture, etc., those have all been changed in some way, or some have been changed to make you see that thing in a different way. Okay. Now, those are the only two categories that we had for a long, long time in art. But in the mid 1900s, all of a sudden, people started making art that didn't have images. And people didn't know what to call it because there was no word for it. Nobody had really ever done this before as like a modern artist. And so people started calling it abstract expressionism because they thought, well, maybe it's just them kind of expressing themselves. But that was kind of confusing because then people would look at it and they would think, well, what am I supposed to see? If it's abstract, that means that it's based upon something physical. And that always wasn't the case. And so more recently, people have created a new word, non representational or non objective, which means there's no imagery in it at all. And I think that's a little bit more descriptive and it helps us understand those categories a little bit better. So, representational means it looks real, abstract means something in it has been altered, but you can still recognize it. And then non representational means that it's just the visual elements line, shape, color, etc. But there's no imagery used at all. Now, with non representational art, a lot of people judge this type of art and they say anybody could do it, that it's easy. And that's not really true. If you think about other types of art like music, does music have to have lyrics to be good? No. A lot of people actually prefer instrumental music versus lyrical music. And so, why do dances have to be choreographed to be good, or can sometimes a spontaneous, in the moment dance be more emotional and expressive? And so, I think with non objective artwork, it is really hard to make things look good without imagery. And a lot of people don't realize that. But back in the day, people all learned how to work representational. And so people would have had to learn to do portraits and still lives and landscapes. And then they would have chose to work abstract or non-representational. And today in this modern world that we live in, there are a lot of people that are bypassing that traditional training and they're just saying, well, I don't draw well. I'm going to be a non representational or abstract artist. And so I think sometimes you can tell that there's a lack of skill when people haven't gone through maybe that proper training. So hopefully that helps you understand these categories a little bit more. So we're going to go through some examples of these. So here we see a painting of a pipe. This was created by Magritte. And Magritte was also a surrealist who played around with ideas of subconsciousness and memories and childhood and dreams. And here it's a painting of a pipe. It looks real, so we would definitely call it representational. But underneath it in French, he wrote, "This is not a pipe." And he did this just to be silly, basically because it's a painting. And so he's saying, even though it looks real, it's not a pipe. Because some people say that paintings are illusions because they're not real. Now, here we can see in this painting here, it looks very representational, maybe from a different time period, yet all the elements look very natural, and so we would call that representational. Uh, Color photography that's been unedited is obviously very representational. This photographer takes photographs of celebrities up close without any editing to show us what they really look like. And it makes you realize that what we see on the magazine covers are often abstract. So that brings us to abstract. And so abstract again means skewed or altered from reality. And these are some paintings of some trees by an artist named Pierre Modrian. And Modrian, he was an abstract artist that became a non-objective artist or non-representational artist eventually. But he didn't really like nature, and so throughout his career, he started purging the nature out of his artwork. And so we can see this tree has been painted on the left side, but the colors are not very natural. There's like reds and oranges and blues in the tree. The anatomy of the tree doesn't really look exact. The texture of the sky and the ground kind of move together. And so we have lines, color, and texture that are not natural. So those elements have been altered, thus making it abstract. Very expressive, though. And so a lot of times artists abstract things to make it more expressive and to make it emphasize maybe a mood or a feeling. Now, black and white photography is abstract as well. Do we see in black and white? No, we see in color. And so that's one of the reasons I think people like black and white photography is because it makes them see the world in a different way. So even though it's a subtle abstraction, because we don't see in black and white, it makes it an abstract image. And so this would definitely be an example. Now, I've had students before say, well, what if it's a black and white photo of a panda bear or a keyboard? Well, obviously there are things that are naturally black and white, so I'm not going to put that on the test to confuse you. But black and white photography of color objects would definitely be abstract. And then this is more of an extreme version of abstraction. This is a painting of one of Picasso's mistresses painted by Picasso, and we can see that it's extremely abstracted. The proportions and anatomy of the face, the lines, the colors, the values, nothing really looks real. Yet we can still identify that it's human. And you may think, well, why would he be so mean and paint one of his mistresses to look like this? Well, it wasn't meant to be taken literally. When Picasso was younger, he had seen an exhibit of African and Iberian masks, and those really influenced his process because it made him think about how people may not wear masks anymore, like maybe they did back in ancient or more primitive times, but we act different ways that maybe aren't really true to who we are. And so he started painting people in more of modern times with those kind of mask-like features to show that we all are a different version of what other people see. And that brings us to non-representational art. And that's where there's no image in the artwork at all. It's just the visual elements. So again, the visual elements are line, shape, color, texture, motion, all those different things. And so looking at these pieces, they're very geometric and made up of just the primary colors in black and white. And the person that painted these was also Pierre Modrian, the guy that I just showed you his paintings of his trees. Eventually, he started purging all the imagery from his work altogether, and he just started using red, blue, and yellow, and black and white, and painting rectangles and squares. And he did this for the rest of his career. Now, this may not be the most imaginative thing you've seen before. However, nobody had done this before. And so he was one of the first artists that worked this minimal. And that's where the term minimalism came from, which means that artists just kind of got rid of imagery and they worked with just a minimal amount of information and subject matter. And so here we see just these geometric shapes and squares. And I know I said that maybe this isn't that exciting to you all, but this really inspired fashion and architecture and all sorts of things back when it was made. If you go back and look at fashion of this time, people wore patterned clothing that looked like this. The buildings started to look very minimal like this. So it really did influence the whole world. Jackson Pollock is also another um, non-objective artist. He started out, or non-representational. He started out working under Thomas Hart Benton, who was classically trained, and so was Pollock. And Pollock started doing portraits and abstract and landscapes and everything. And then one day he's like, I want to be me. I want to do something that's different. And so I guess he probably made a drip by accident, which normally we would consider a drip to be a mistake. But he was like, this kind of, had energy in it. Why do I have to put my canvas on an easel? What if I put it on the floor? And why do I have to paint with a brush? What if I use a stick or a turkey baster or whatever I want? And what if I listen to music and use the same energy in the music in my work? And so that's what he really started to do. Is it was a performance. It wasn't just a painting. And so he literally stood on his paintings, got out house paint because house paint is much more fluid and kind of stringy. And he would play his favorite music, and he would dance around, whipping his hair back and forth and making these one of a kind drip paintings that no one had ever seen before. And a lot of people hated this. They were really upset. They felt offended. But I think the only reason is because he became very successful, and his paintings today now sell for millions of dollars. But money is just an idea, and so is art. And so when you use an idea to represent an idea, it gets very distorted. And when we talk about a lot of these artists, the money that their artwork's worth today is not anywhere near what they were getting paid for it when they were alive. And so usually that's not the driving force behind their creativity. And so he would just have fun doing this, and any of you doing this would have fun as long as you didn't have to clean up the mess, the next day. And there's a video here if you want to see a video of him painting. Now, form and content, we talked about the visual categories, and form and content, they're kind of like the meat and bones of art. So the form is all the physical components of the artwork. It's what you see, what it's made of, all the physical things that you can see. Content is the message or meaning that you get from the work of art. And so if the content is changed, then the form will be changed. And if the form is changed, then the content will be different. And those things, you can't really separate them. Now, think about if you've ever gone to, let's say, the library to check out a book. You've probably seen books before that had really cool looking book covers, but as you read the story, it was not that exciting, and maybe it was kind of a letdown. You've probably also seen books maybe you had to read for classes that you were in, and the book cover looked boring, but then you read the book and you were like, wow, this was amazing. And then you probably found some before that had a really nice book cover and the story was equally interesting. And so that's kind of how I think of form and content, is you want them to go hand in hand, but we can't really control what the viewer is going to do. And so it's really up to us to decide, what if we know why the artist did it, how well did they execute that? And so things can be very similar, but even if there's some differences, the content is going to be different as well. So here's an example of two sculptures that have some similarities, but also some clear differences as well. If we were to list all the formal qualities that are the same, we could say that they're both sculptures. They both appear to be made of some type of stone. They're three-dimensional. And then if we were to talk about the form or all the visual things that are different, maybe we could say that the image on the left is much more anatomically correct, much more smooth. Maybe it's closer to representational, where the image on the right is more geometric and it's more blocky. It's got a coarser texture to it, and it looks very abstract. Now, when we talk about the form, the content or the message or meaning, is that the same with both of these? We can say that they're both kissing, but that's something we can see. And so that would make it part of the form. But the content is how we feel, the reaction. And I think with a quick glance of perceiving, some people might say, oh, yeah, they're the same. But really, they're not. If we were to put these into a third grade classroom, you know the children would not react the same way to both of these. If we were to put these in a room with our grandparents, they would not react to these the same way. All right. One is very sensual, romantic. You almost feel like you probably shouldn't look at it because maybe it's a little more graphic than you would want to see. Where the other one is very childlike and kind of playful, maybe even a little primitive, and it feels more like me caveman, you cavewoman, let's reproduce. Like it feels very kind of primitive. And so because the form is different, the content is very different as well. One seems like this idealized romantic novel kiss, and the other one, it seems much more kind of playful and simple, you know. So you have to realize that if the form is different, the content is going to be different as well. Now, Georgia O'Keeffe was known for painting flowers. She painted a lot of other things, but a lot of people know her for painting flowers up close and making them huge. And she said she did this because she thought flowers were beautiful, but that people didn't notice them because they were so small. And so she made them really big. And they're very sensual, pretty, imaginative. They make you feel all kinds of maybe happy feelings. Van Gogh also painted flowers, though. And when we look at his artwork, they don't really look happy, right? Van Gogh's image on the left here, they're so yellow, they almost feel so intense and sad. And then the one on the right, they look like they've been murdered and like they're dying on the countertop, suffering. And normally when we look at flowers, we don't feel that way about them. And so I think that it goes to show that by changing the texture and color and all the other elements, we can make the content, the message or meaning, also be changed as well. And then lastly, we're going to talk about iconography or symbolism. Now, this can be hard to understand, and this can be the biggest thing that makes people not connect to artwork from other time periods or places. And it's because they think they're stupid and they don't understand. But it just takes a little bit of research and understanding of the symbolism and iconography to really to start to understand artwork from other places or times or religions or whatever. So, and even personal symbolism that we use. So in this image here, we can see this is from the 7th century in India. And this big crack in the center is symbolic of a river. And all these other creatures and animals are all symbolic of the Hindu religion. And so people of that religion and of this time period would have seen this and understood every part of it. Where if you come from another part of the world or another time period, you may not recognize some of that symbolism, but we could study it and compare it to other artwork made from that same place and time and get more of an understanding of those things. We talked about this painting earlier, but I didn't really talk about some of the symbolism. How did we know that was an angel? As well, because it has wings, but that's not natural. So that would be a Western culture symbol of a human with wings equals an angel. We also see a flying crucifix coming in from one of the windows, and that is obviously symbolic of Jesus's crucifixion. There's a vase with irises, which is the flower symbolic of Mary and her purity. There's a blown out candle that symbolizes Jesus's purpose for his birth, which was to basically die for humanity's sins, according to the Christian faith. And so there's a lot of symbolism people of that religion would have recognized and understood during the Renaissance, or even maybe still today if they're of that religion or faith. Now here you may be like, well, why did he throw in a wedding photo? Well, this is a wedding photo, and how do we know it's a wedding photo? Because of the contemporary symbols that are used. And so anybody in the Western world would see this and know the white wedding dress is a symbol, the bouquet is a symbol, the kiss is a symbol, the having the church is a symbol. So all these things are symbolic icons that would occur to let us know that this is a wedding, and we wouldn't even really have to think about it. But this is a wedding portrait, but this one's from the 1400s, 1434 to be exact. And most people would have not known that. Why? Because this is from Europe from the early Renaissance in 1434. And some of the symbols and icons were different back then. But if we go through this, you'll realize that there's a lot going on in this small portrait. And this portrait has a lot of controversy around it too, but most books agree with the symbolism that I'll be telling you. Some it's a little bit different. But notice first the bride is wearing green, and maybe you'll think, well, she's wearing green because she looks like she's pregnant. But if you look closer, she's actually holding her dress up to make it look like she's pregnant. And that's because fertility and offspring was one of the main goals of getting married back then. And that's because during the Renaissance and Middle Ages, people were dying of the plague. And so having children was very important to sustain your family name. And so green is a symbol for fertility, and holding up her dress like she has a pregnant womb would have also been symbolic that hopefully their wedding brings forth offspring. Now, if you look right below her feet, there's a little dog, and you may think, well, why would someone have their dog painted in their wedding portrait? Well, the dog is symbol of fidelity or faithfulness. You've probably heard dogs be called man's best friend before, and maybe you've even heard of the dog named Fido. It's a common dog name. It's short for fidelity as well. And so we can see the dog, and it's symbolizing that hopefully they don't stray from each other and that they're loyal to each other. But because it's painted so well, we can also tell the breed of the dog. And this would have been a breed that had to be imported. So it also becomes a symbol of wealth as well. And then right next to the dog, we can see some Renaissance, what look like flip flops. And you may think, why wouldn't they have moved those like for their painting? Well, by taking off their shoes, it shows that this is a holy ground and holy ceremony that's taken place. And so again, another little symbol. And then if you go up to the man's back, next to the window, you'll see that there's fruit ripening in the window, and that's symbolic of again fertility. Hopefully, that she'll become ripe with offspring like fruit. And some say that even their position in the home suggests their gender roles at that time. In the 1400s, the man would have gone out to work every day and the woman would have stayed home. So that explains why he's positioned closer to the window and she's closer to the bed. And then if you look really closely on the back wall, you'll see a mirror, and the mirror is a symbol of God. They could not represent God in physical form or human form in the early Renaissance, and so mirrors were often used as a symbol of God's eye that sees everything. And just to show you up close, look inside of that little tiny mirror that was painted. You can see, and lastly, here's a little close up of the dog just so you can see how cute it was. So that concludes lecture number 2. So now, after looking at the test number 1 study guide, you should be able, through these lectures, to be able to get all the information on there and be prepared for test number 1.